All right, so want to get a handle on how a future president might, shake things up on the world stage.
Hmm.
Well, Project 2025, that's what we're diving into today, lays out some pretty bold ideas from a conservative viewpoint
Okay.
on how they'd revamp the whole State Department.
Right.
It's not just like tweaking a few policies, it's a total like overhaul of how things are run.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah.
The document actually frames it as a solution to a problem,
Mm-hmm.
this perceived disconnect
Uh-huh.
between conservative presidents and the State Department itself.
Okay.
They claim there's this kind of tug-of-war going on, right?
Interesting.
Because of differing political leanings within the department,
Mm.
and that this leads to resistance
Okay.
against conservative policy goals.
So you're saying they believe there's like built-in friction
Yeah.
that a conservative president might actually face pushback from, the very people who are supposed to be carrying out their foreign policy.
That's exactly the argument they're making.
Wow.
And to understand the scale of the changes they're proposing, I think it helps to have a little historical context.
Yeah, for sure.
They take us all the way back to Thomas Jefferson's tiny team in 1789
Okay.
and trace how the State Department evolved, right, into the massive operation it is today.
Yeah.
Nearly 80,000 employees
Wow.
across almost 300 locations worldwide.
That's incredible.
It's a far cry from those early days.
Wow. Talk about a growth spurt.
Yeah.
It really highlights how much America's role in the world has changed. But the source we're looking at is pretty critical of where the State Department is today. They actually call it a crippled institution, claiming it's become, ineffective and detached from the president's vision.
Yeah, their critique goes beyond just, inefficiency, though. They argue that the department has developed this independent mindset, also operating as like a separate entity that thinks it knows best,
Wow.
even if it clashes with what the president wants.
Okay, so they've laid out the problem as they see it. But let's get into the solutions.
Right.
How does Project 2025 actually propose to fix all of this?
Well, they start with leadership,
Okay.
and it's radical.
Okay.
Imagine this. On day one of a new administration, every single ambassador,
Wow.
whether a political appointee or a career diplomat, is asked to resign.
Whoa, that's a clean sweep. It would certainly send a message, wouldn't it? They're not messing around when it comes to making sure everyone's on, aligned with the new president's agenda.
Absolutely. And it goes beyond ambassadors.
Okay.
They want key positions throughout the State Department
Right.
filled with individuals who share the president's ideology and policy goals.
Makes sense.
It's about establishing a clear chain of command and ensuring that everyone is on board
Yep.
with the direction from the top.
Okay, so new leadership's in place, all ready to go. What's next in this this grand plan?
Well, before any major policy changes are made, Project 2025 calls for a complete strategic review.
Okay.
Everything, ongoing negotiations, funding commitments, even treaties,
Wow.
gets put on hold for reassessment.
Mm.
This is where, those differing political leanings they mentioned earlier would come into play.
Okay.
For example, agreements reached under a previous administration
Right.
might be scrapped, right?
Okay.
If they don't align with the new president's priorities.
That's a pretty dramatic move. Essentially hitting the pause button on the entire State Department's operations.
Yeah.
It would definitely signal a major shift in direction.
Yeah, and it highlights their focus
Okay.
on ensuring that everything the State Department does directly serves American interests.
Right.
As defined by the
Of
president.
course.
Now, within that framework,
Yeah.
there are certain hot-button issues they tackle head-on.
Okay.
Immigration is one of them.
All right, let's unpack that.
Okay.
What's their take on immigration?
They call for a much tougher stance,
Okay.
advocating for something called strict reciprocity in visa policies.
Strict reciprocity.
Basically, if a country makes it difficult for American citizens to get visas, the U.S. would do the same to their citizens.
Interesting.
No more one-sided generosity, they say.
So they're playing hardball when it comes to visas.
Yeah.
What else is on their immigration wish list?
Well, they want full enforcement of sanctions on countries that don't cooperate with deportations of their citizens from the U.S.
Right.
And they take aim at programs like the diversity visa,
Okay.
claiming it poses potential security risks.
It sounds like they want to significantly restrict immigration,
Yeah.
both in terms of who gets in and how deportations are handled. It's likely to be a controversial part of their plan. Now, let's talk about China. No conversation about U.S. foreign policy would be complete without it.
Right, and the document doesn't mince words.
Okay.
They label China an outright threat, not just a competitor.
Oh.
They propose adopting a strategy similar to the Cold War,
Yeah.
aimed at making any aggression from China unaffordable.
Wow, that's a strong statement.
Yeah.
So how would they actually implement this kind of strategy? What are they proposing?
Well, it's a multifaceted approach.
Okay.
They want to beef up military capabilities in the region,
Hmm.
strengthen alliances with countries like Japan, South Korea,
Right.
and take a much tougher stance on trade and economic policies.
So they're not just talking about military might.
Yep.
They're aiming to contain China's influence on multiple fronts: economic, diplomatic, and military.
Exactly.
That's a pretty comprehensive strategy. Now, shifting gears a bit, let's talk about another country that's been a source of tension for the U.S.-Iran.
Project 2025 is pretty critical of, past attempts at diplomacy with Iran.
Okay.
They argue that the Obama administration, for example, missed an opportunity during the 2009 Green Movement protests
Right.
to support the Iranian people's desire for democracy.
Okay.
They also slam the idea of easing sanctions on the current regime.
So a more interventionist approach.
Yeah.
Actively tried to shape events inside Iran rather than just negotiating with the government.
Yeah.
That's a pretty big departure from the more cautious approach we've seen in recent years.
For sure.
Now, let's turn our attention to another country in the Western Hemisphere that's been in the headlines for all the wrong reasons, Venezuela.
The document paints a grim picture of Venezuela, describing its decline from a prosperous ally to what they call a cautionary tale of failed socialist policies.
Right.
They highlight the growing influence of China and Iran in the country,
Okay.
which they view as a major threat.
Yeah.
They're calling for a unified response
Okay.
with the entire Western Hemisphere
Right.
to push back against these external forces.
It sounds like they see Venezuela as a potential flashpoint, a place where U.S. adversaries are gaining a foothold right on America's doorstep.
Yeah.
And they're advocating for a strong, coordinated pushback, not just from the U.S., but from all the countries in the region. Now, we can't talk about global hotspots without addressing the elephant in the room, Russia, and the ongoing war in Ukraine.
And here's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
The document actually presents 3 different viewpoints
Wow.
within the conservative movement itself
Okay.
on how to handle the situation.
Interesting.
It acknowledges that there's no easy answer
Yeah.
and lays out the arguments for each perspective.
Okay, let's dive into these different viewpoints. What's the first one?
All right, the first group takes a hard line,
Okay.
arguing that Russia poses a direct threat to U.S. interests and the global order.
Right.
They want to see continued and even increased U.S. involvement,
Okay.
including military and economic aid to Ukraine,
Hmm.
and a strong NATO presence in the region.
Okay.
Their goal is the defeat of Putin and a return to the pre-invasion borders.
So they see this as a fight that the U.S. needs to be fully engaged in.
Yeah.
What about the second viewpoint?
Okay, the second group takes a more isolationist approach,
Okay.
claiming that supporting Ukraine is not in America's national interest.
Hmm.
They question Ukraine's strategic importance
Okay.
and highlight its history of corruption.
Right.
They believe European nations should take the lead,
Okay.
while the U.S. focuses its resources elsewhere.
So a more hands-off approach, prioritizing American interests above all else.
Right.
Right. What about the third viewpoint?
Okay.
What's their take on this complex situation?
The third group tries to find a middle ground.
Okay.
They believe that every foreign policy decision should be guided by a simple question: what's in the best interest of the American people?
Right.
They support limited involvement in Ukraine,
Okay.
focusing on military aid, while leaving economic assistance to European allies.
Makes sense.
They also stress fiscal responsibility and avoiding any actions that could risk American lives.
So a more pragmatic approach,
Yeah.
carefully weighing the costs and benefits of U.S. involvement.
Right.
It's fascinating how, even within a single ideological movement, there can be such a diversity of opinions on a complex issue like the war in Ukraine. Now, we've covered Russia, China, Iran, Venezuela, a lot of potential hotspots.
Yeah.
But what about North Korea? How does Project 2025 address the ongoing nuclear threat from Pyongyang?
Denuclearization remains the primary goal,
Okay.
with a focus on ensuring North Korea can't threaten the U.S. or its allies.
Mm-hmm.
The document stresses the importance of strong alliances with South Korea and Japan,
Right.
and a zero-tolerance policy for nuclear blackmail.
Of course.
They advocate for maintaining a strong military presence in the region
Okay.
and continuing to pressure the regime through sanctions and diplomatic isolation.
So no appeasement, no concessions.
Nope.
Just unrelenting pressure until North Korea gives up its nuclear ambitions. It's a tough stance, for sure.
It is.
Now, we've covered a lot of ground here, focusing on some of the most pressing issues in U.S. foreign policy.
Yeah.
But Project 2025 doesn't stop there.
No.
It outlines a vision for American engagement across the globe, from the Western Hemisphere to the Middle East, Africa, and even the Arctic.
And that's exactly where we'll pick up in the next part of our deep dive.
Perfect.
We'll explore how Project 2025 proposes to reshape American diplomacy in those key regions and beyond.
Yeah.
Picking up where we left off, let's look at how Project 2025 envisions the U.S. engaging with specific regions around the world,
Okay.
starting closer to home in the Western Hemisphere.
All right.
They call for a much more assertive approach.
What would that look like in practical terms? What kind of changes are they talking about?
Well, one key area they focus on is Mexico.
Okay.
They advocate for a sovereign Mexico policy,
Mexico. Okay.
arguing that the current situation, with powerful drug cartels operating there,
Right.
poses a direct threat to U.S. national security.
Yeah. That makes sense, given how interconnected the U.S. and Mexico are. They're basically saying that a weak Mexico is a problem for the U.S.
Exactly. And they link it directly to, the fentanyl crisis
Right.
ravaging communities across the U.S. They argue that these cartels are working with Chinese suppliers to flood America with this deadly drug.
Right.
They want to see a coordinated effort with Mexico
Yeah.
and other regional partners to disrupt this supply chain.
So it's not just about, traditional security cooperation. It's
Yeah.
about tackling a public health emergency that's directly impacting, people in the U.S.
Exactly.
What else do they highlight in terms of priorities for the Western Hemisphere?
Well, they push for a hemisphere-centered approach to industry and energy.
Hemisphere-centered. Okay.
Essentially, they want to move away from relying on, distant suppliers,
Right.
particularly China, and focus on building stronger economic ties within the Americas.
Interesting. It's like a Made in the Americas initiative, right?
Yeah.
Boosting economic growth and resilience within the region. It would certainly reduce dependence on countries that might not, share American interests.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And when it comes to security threats in the region, they advocate for a local approach.
Local. Okay.
Meaning working closely with democratic partners to counter the influence of China, Iran, and Russia.
So building up those regional alliances as a counterweight to external forces.
Right.
A very proactive stance, trying
Yeah.
to address potential problems before they become major crises.
Exactly.
Now, shifting our focus to another volatile region,
Right.
the Middle East and North Africa.
Project 2025 argues that the U.S. can't afford to disengage from this region,
Right.
despite all the, complexities and challenges.
Yeah, for sure.
They see a vital role for American leadership in preventing further chaos
Okay.
and pushing back against Iran's ambitions.
Okay, so how did they propose to do that? What's their strategy for the Middle East?
Well, they call for a multi-pronged approach,
Okay.
starting with containing Iran's nuclear program
Right.
and its support for regional proxy groups.
Right.
This would involve, reimposing and expanding sanctions, bolstering security cooperation with allies like Israel and Saudi Arabia,
Yeah.
and potentially even supporting, those pushing for democratic change within Iran itself.
So a pretty assertive stance combining diplomatic and economic pressure with possible support for, internal forces seeking change.
Right.
It's a high-risk, high-reward strategy.
It is.
What about the ongoing conflicts and instability in the region? How do they address that?
Well, they emphasize the need to build on the momentum of the Abraham Accords,
Okay.
which saw some Arab states normalizing relations with Israel.
Right.
They specifically mentioned reversing what they see as, the Biden administration's damaging policies towards Saudi Arabia,
Yeah.
aiming to strengthen that alliance as a cornerstone of regional stability.
So they're not just focused on containing Iran, they're
Mhm.
also looking to build, stronger partnerships
No.
and foster cooperation between countries in the region.
Exactly.
Do they address the issue of human rights in the Middle East? It's often a point of contention in U.S. foreign policy.
They do. They highlight the importance of protecting human rights and religious minorities,
Okay.
specifically calling out the persecution of Christians and other groups.
Right.
They argue that promoting freedom and stability
Mm.
requires addressing these concerns alongside security issues.
So a recognition that security and values need to go hand in hand.
Yeah.
Now let's turn our attention to sub-Saharan Africa, a region that's often, overlooked in discussions of U.S. foreign policy.
You're right. It often gets overshadowed by other global hotspots. But Project 2025 argues that Africa's importance to U.S. interests is growing rapidly. They point to its booming population, vast mineral resources, strategic location,
Mm-hmm.
and increasing diplomatic influence on the world stage.
So they're saying the U.S. can't afford to ignore Africa anymore.
Right.
It needs to step up its engagement and compete for influence with other global players who are already, heavily invested there.
Exactly. And they propose a significant shift in how the U.S. approaches Africa,
Okay.
moving away from traditional aid programs
Okay.
and focusing more on fostering free markets and economic growth.
It sounds like a more business-oriented approach,
Yeah.
empowering African countries to become, self-sufficient and prosperous partners,
Right.
rather than just recipients of aid.
That's the idea. They also call for a strong pushback against China's growing influence in Africa,
Mm-hmm.
which they see as a major threat to U.S. interests.
Makes sense.
They want to see the U.S., investing in countering Chinese propaganda,
Okay.
securing critical supply chains for essential minerals,
Right.
and supporting American companies operating on the continent.
So it's about competing with China head-on, not just for resources, but for hearts and minds.
Exactly.
What about the security challenges in Africa? Do they address issues like terrorism and instability?
They do. They highlight the, ongoing threat of terrorism,
Yeah.
particularly from groups like Boko Haram,
Yeah.
and urge the U.S. to, support local security forces in their efforts to counter these groups.
Right.
They argue that instability in Africa can have ripple effects
Hmm.
that ultimately threaten U.S. interests both at home and abroad.
It's a reminder that what happens in seemingly, far-off places can ultimately impact the security and well-being of people in the U.S.
Sure.
Now let's shift our focus to Europe, a region with long-standing ties to the U.S., but also some complex dynamics.
You're right. It's a relationship with a lot of history. Project 2025 acknowledges the importance of the transatlantic partnership,
Mm-hmm.
but calls for a more balanced approach.
Balanced how so?
They want to see European nations taking on a greater share of the burden for their own defense
Yeah.
and contributing more to NATO.
So they're essentially saying it's time for Europe to step up and become a more equal partner,
Yeah.
both militarily and economically.
Exactly. And they also call for a thorough review of trade agreements with the EU
Yeah.
to ensure they're fair to American businesses.
Right.
They even mention the need to develop, stronger ties with the UK post-Brexit,
Okay.
potentially as a counterweight to the EU's growing influence.
So it's about modernizing the transatlantic partnership, making it more equitable and mutually beneficial.
Right.
Now let's turn our attention to another region that's becoming increasingly important for U.S. interests, South and Central Asia.
This is where India takes center stage. Project 2025 sees India as a key partner in countering China's rise and ensuring stability in the Indo-Pacific region.
They're not shy about emphasizing India's strategic importance, are they? It seems like they see India as a crucial player in their vision for U.S. foreign policy.
Absolutely. They want to deepen the relationship with India on multiple fronts: military cooperation, economic ties, diplomatic coordination,
Right.
making it a cornerstone of U.S. strategy in the region.
What specific actions do they propose to achieve that? How do they plan to, strengthen the U.S.-India partnership?
Well, they advocate for strengthening the Quad,
Okay, the Qua.
the informal alliance between the U.S., India, Japan, and Australia,
Right.
as a platform for coordinating strategy and pushing back against China's assertiveness.
Okay.
They also want to see, increased military exercises and arms sales to India.
Right.
helping them build up their capabilities to counter China's military buildup.
It sounds like a pretty robust approach, using India as a bulwark against China's ambitions in Asia. Do they acknowledge the, potential challenges and complexities in this region?
They do. They recognize the ongoing challenges, including the threat of terrorism emanating from Afghanistan following the U.S. withdrawal,
Right.
and the long-standing tensions between India and Pakistan. They call for a reevaluation of the U.S. relationship with Pakistan, advocating for a more cautious approach, given the Taliban's return to power in Afghanistan.
So a recognition that there are no easy solutions in this region
Nope.
and a need for a pragmatic, clear-eyed assessment of U.S. interests and potential partnerships.
Sure.
Now let's move on to a region that's gaining increasing attention as climate change reshapes the global landscape, the Arctic.
Project 2025 highlights the Arctic's growing strategic importance,
Okay.
pointing to its vast resources and the potential for new shipping routes as the ice melts.
Right.
They emphasize the need for the U.S. to assert its presence and protect its interests in this increasingly contested region.
They see the Arctic as a new frontier, right? A potential battleground for resources and influence.
Yeah.
What do they propose the U.S. should do to, secure its interests in this icy expanse?
Well, they call for a robust military presence in the Arctic, investing in icebreakers and other capabilities needed to operate effectively in this, challenging environment.
Right.
They also want to see increased cooperation with NATO allies,
Okay.
recognizing that the Arctic is becoming a key theater for potential conflict with Russia.
It seems like they're really taking the, changing geopolitical landscape seriously, realizing that the Arctic is no longer a, remote, irrelevant backwater.
Exactly. And it's not just about military presence.
Okay.
They also stress the importance of economic engagement,
Okay.
encouraging American companies to invest in the Arctic and compete for resources with rivals like China,
Right.
which has declared itself a near-Arctic state.
It's all about establishing a foothold in this strategic region,
Yeah,
both militarily and economically.
exactly.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, from Mexico to the Middle East to the Arctic.
Yeah.
Getting a sense of how Project 2025 envisions the U.S. engaging with the world on a regional level. But this blueprint goes beyond, specific countries and regions. It also outlines a broader approach to international organizations.
And that's where we'll pick up in the next part of our deep dive.
Perfect.
We'll explore how Project 2025 proposes to reshape U.S. involvement in multilateral institutions like the United Nations and the World Health Organization.
We've been unpacking this Project 2025 document, and now I'm curious about, its take on international organizations. Those big multilateral institutions like the UN, the WHO, they're often seen as central to global cooperation. But it sounds like this plan has a different perspective.
Yeah, they definitely take a more skeptical view. The document argues against, blindly supporting these organizations,
Okay.
claiming that U.S. involvement should always, put American interests first. It's a more, I guess you could say, transactional approach, focusing on what the U.S. gets out of its participation, rather than just supporting global cooperation for its own sake.
So they're not opposed to working with these organizations, but they want to make sure it's a good deal for the U.S.
Right. No more blank checks, so to speak.
Exactly.
They claim that the U.S. has often been taken advantage of by these organizations, pouring in resources while getting little in return.
Okay.
They even point to, the World Health Organization handling of the COVID-19 pandemic as an example
Right.
of how these institutions can fail to serve American interests,
Yeah.
potentially even harming them.
That's a pretty serious accusation. So what do they actually propose doing about it? How do they envision reshaping, U.S. involvement in these organizations?
Well, they start by calling for a thorough review of U.S. participation in every international organization.
Wow. Every single one.
Yeah. Think of it as like a massive audit, right?
Okay.
Looking at how much money is being spent, what results are being achieved, and whether those outcomes actually align with, U.S. priorities.
Sounds like they want to bring some serious accountability to how the U.S. engages with these, global bodies, not just throwing money at problems, but making sure it's being used effectively and in a way that benefits the U.S.
Right. And it goes beyond just, the financial aspect. They also want to scrutinize, the policies and actions of these organizations,
Okay.
making sure U.S. taxpayer dollars aren't being used to promote agendas that contradict American values.
Right, right.
They specifically raise concerns about issues like abortion, population control, and even support for, terrorist activities.
So aligning U.S. funding with its core principles, they're not afraid to use their financial leverage to push these organizations in a direction that's, more favorable to American interests. But what about beyond money? How do they see the U.S. acting, like, within these organizations?
They advocate for a much more assertive diplomatic posture,
Okay.
pushing back against initiatives that undermine U.S. interest
Mm.
and building coalitions with, like-minded countries to promote shared goals.
Mm.
They even suggest the possibility of, withdrawing from organizations.
Hmm.
They consistently fail to serve American interests or become overly reliant on U.S. funding.
That's a pretty strong stance. It's a big shift from the more cooperative multilateral approach we've seen in recent years.
It definitely signals a willingness to, go it alone if necessary, a belief that the U.S. needs to prioritize its own interests
Right.
and be prepared to act unilaterally if those interests are threatened.
So a more assertive, less apologetic approach to, global leadership, putting America first in its dealings with the world. Now, we've talked a lot about the big picture stuff, policy shifts, diplomatic strategies, engagement with other countries and organizations. But this plan also gets into the nuts and bolts of the State Department itself. What do they have to say about how the department actually, operates?
They're pretty critical of the current structure.
Yeah.
They argue that the State Department has become bloated and inefficient,
Mm.
with a sprawling bureaucracy that slows down decision-making and hinders its, effectiveness. They want to streamline the whole operation.
So some bureaucratic spring cleaning, less red tape, more efficiency.
Exactly. They propose a major reorganization,
Yeah.
consolidating offices, eliminating redundancies, and cutting overhead costs. They also want to centralize foreign aid authorities under a single director,
Hmm.
ensuring all assistance programs align with, overall U.S. foreign policy goals.
It's about cutting the fat, making sure everyone's on the same page, and ensuring that every action taken serves like a clear strategic purpose.
Right. And they go even further, calling for a major revamp of U.S. Public diplomacy efforts.
Public diplomacy, okay.
They argue that the current system is outdated and ineffective
Okay.
in communicating American values and countering propaganda from adversaries like, China and Russia.
It's like they want to reboot how America tells its story to the world, projecting its values, highlighting its strengths, and pushing back against negative narratives. In today's world, that kind of strategic communication is, more important than ever.
They definitely see it as a key tool in this new era of, geopolitical competition.
For sure.
And finally, they recognize the growing importance of cyber diplomacy.
Cyber diplomacy.
The idea that, the online world is a critical battleground in international affairs. They want the U.S. to take a more assertive approach
Okay.
to shaping global norms in cyberspace,
Right.
countering digital authoritarianism, and protecting U.S. interests from cyber attacks.
So a more proactive, strategic approach to navigating the digital world,
Yeah.
which is, increasingly intertwined with real-world geopolitics.
Exactly. They argue that to be effective in the 21st century, the State Department needs to be leaner, more agile,
Right.
and more closely aligned with the president's overall vision for U.S. foreign policy.
Well, this deep dive into Project 2025 has been fascinating. It lays out a very specific and often controversial roadmap for how a future administration might approach, U.S. foreign policy. It's a vision that emphasizes American interests, assertive leadership, and a willingness to challenge the status quo.
And whether you agree or disagree with its, specific recommendations, it offers a valuable glimpse into one possible future for American diplomacy. It forces us to confront some, fundamental questions about the role of the U.S. in the world,
Yeah.
the challenges it faces, and the choices it must make in the years ahead.
It's a reminder that foreign policy isn't some, abstract concept happening far away. It directly impacts our lives and the future we're building. It's up to each of us to, engage with these issues, understand the different perspectives, and think critically about what kind of world we want to live in and what role we believe the U.S. should play in shaping that world.